So what I want to do is, in a sort of fire thief manner, just grab a few minutes at the beginning to explain how this afternoon's going and also to make a few comments. And the how is as follows, that there will be an academic panel that Neil Safier will be responsible for, and he will introduce you to our speakers, but I do want to thank you all very, very much for coming. After the panel, Jake Fredericks is going to talk a little bit about the exhibition, The Americas on Fire, and this is the third of a series of exhibitions that thematically link to the IBES Seminar and Arts Program. He will talk to you about that. We will invite you to grab a drink, and then as you're beginning to bubble up with ordinary chatting, Wendy Woodson will begin a performance. So if need be, a few of us will usher you, but what we would ask you to do is, as you hear one mic'd voice riding over the top of the ordinary chatting, to take a seat again for the presentation. For those of you who were here last year, you will know that Wendy, who is Professor of Theatre and Dance from Amherst College, will be doing a theatricalised monologue around the theme, and this year the theme is fire, and so she'll be talking on Fire Away. So, academic panel, introduction to this superb exhibition, and then Wendy's performance, and then you're free to talk as loudly as you wish and to drink as much as you wish within reason. I want to thank Tara Kingsley especially for all of her matchwork behind the scenes. To twist an old idiom, there's no fire without fire, and her kindling collection and match striking were essential to make this week's afternoon's program work. IBES is collaborating, and again I want to thank Vanessa, Crystal, Mariella and Bonnie for all of their work behind the scenes too. And I have a small footnote to that, which was that over the last month I have, whenever I've had an opportunity, asked Vanessa to ensure she does not give birth until this is over, and in labour now. So she held off. It works, you know, you just need someone with authority to control human reproduction, and it's not a mystery after all. And, you know, we're all waiting to find out which of us the baby will be named after. Possibly it'll be named Fire, but it worked. I'd like to welcome Matt, Guilhem, Alessandra, Jake and Wendy to Brown, and to welcome Andrew for crossing the campus. And in particular, as I hand over, I do want to thank you, Neil Safier, for being a playmate and being willing to play fire with me and making this happen. Thank you.
I didn't realize that this might fall to me, but it occurs to me that as Lenore was giving all of her thanks to all of the wonderful people, she left one very important person out, which is herself. So let me just say, as somebody who's now collaborated with Lenore for 3 years going, and who is impressed, like I think everyone that I have met, with her energy, her brilliance, her creativity, her catalytic powers, like fire itself. I think it's an opportune moment to thank you, Lenore, for everything that you've done to bring this campus together and to bring the other constituencies around this campus together for these events. So, thank you. This is going to be a panel presentation on the Americas and the generative power of fire. And as those of us who were at the keynote lecture yesterday by Steve Pine learned, many of the spaces that we inhabit in our daily lives are shaped by fire, even if we don't know that they are as well. You will not be surprised to know that libraries spend a lot of time thinking about fire, or, as it were, how to avoid fire happening in their midst. The fireplace behind me is a vestige of a time when, as Steve Pine said yesterday, buildings like this were heated by fires. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about the the balancing needs of heating and the ability to protect our priceless collection anymore. But we also have cases along the wall housing these spectacular books that were specifically designed in order to be fire retardant, fire repellent. So even here, this is a space that is shaped in many ways by fire. The focus of this academic panel is on Mexico, I would say, even more than the Americas, New Mexico and Old Mexico, as it were, kind of like New Europe and Old Europe in a bygone age. This, interestingly, for those of you who have been, may have been present at the opening lecture by Pamela Smith, we saw a brilliant demonstration of how Europeans conceptualized fire and used fire across a startling array of media. Yesterday's keynote with Steve Pine, he mentioned that at the very tail end of his lecture, that the thing that he found most similar to fire in all of his many, many decades of studying fire was humanity itself. The human species co-evolving in many ways with fire. And it occurred to me that, for me anyway, that this was a very powerful moment because it made me realize that we are in an environment, thinking about fire, where humans and this combustive activity are somehow being compared with each other. And I thought that that this was very appropriate for the kinds of scholarship and themes that are going to be addressed today. That fire and symbolic power often skips across conceptual categories. This is an insight that in the last several decades, anthropologists have had a lot to say to us about, including the challenging of a nature versus culture duality, challenging of the boundaries between human and animal relations, and places like the Amazon River region, as well as central Mexico, are key and really crucial sites for understanding how that dynamic takes place. So in order to explore some of these thoughts and ideas further, we have an extraordinary array of panelists that are here from, as Lenore mentioned, across the campus and across the continent, in fact. Andrew Scherer, who will be presenting Ceremonies of Smoke and Flame Among the Ancient Maya, is an anthropological archaeologist and biological anthropologist here at Brown, but his bioarchaeological research takes him to Maya sites throughout Mexico and Guatemala, including Piedras Negras, Yaxhua, and El Sots. Should have checked that one in advance of trying to say it in a public setting. Andrew's research focuses on mortuary archaeology, warfare and violence, political organization, diet and subsistence, and landscape archaeology. Here at Brown, Andrew also co-directs an interdisciplinary archaeological research project that explores classic Maya polities in Guatemala and Mexico. Following Andrew is our colleague Matt Liebmann from Harvard, presenting on When the Little Firekeeper Ran Away, Pueblo People, Franciscan Missions, and Wildfires in 17th century Mexico. Matt is an associate professor of the social science in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard. He studies and researches archaeology and anthropology of the southwestern US and specializes in particular in the contact period and the historic area pueblos of New Mexico. Following Matt is Guilhem Olivier, with a presentation entitled The New Fire Ceremony, Religion and Power in Ancient Central Mexico. Guilhem is a professor and researcher at the Institute of Historical Research at Mexico's National University, UNAM. He received his PhD in history from the Université de Toulouse-Le Mirail, and he specializes also in Mesoamerican religion. He is the author of numerous works and including most recently Cacería, Sacrificio y Poder en Mesoamérica, which was just published in Mexico in 2015. Rounding off this panel is Alessandra Russo, who is a professor at Columbia University. She will be presenting a presentation entitled Fury and Beauty, Fire in the Limits of Conquest. Alessandra studies the theory, practice, and display of the arts in the early modern period. She trained in art history and historical anthropology at the University of Bologna, at Leiden University, and at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. She has also been visiting researcher at the Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas, UNAM, in Mexico, and research fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, as well as visiting professor at the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art and the École des Hautes Études des Sciences Sociales in Paris. Among her works are The Untranslatable Image, 2014, El Realismo Circular from 2005, and a more recent edited volume called Images Take Flight from 2015. As you can see, it's a spectacular panel. Let me just also take the opportunity to introduce one of our co-curators of the Fire exhibition here at the JCB. This was a curated exhibition that I invited two specialists in these topics, Júnia Ferreira Furtado, a professor at the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil, who unfortunately could not be with us here today, and Jake Frederick, associate professor of history at Lawrence University in Wisconsin and a former fellow of the JCB. Jake has published articles on native political factionalism and race in colonial Mexico. He has articles in ethnohistory, the Americas, as well as the Journal of Colonialism and Colonial Theory. I will also not fail to plug his most recent book, which is co-edited by him and Dr. Tatiana Cejas, but emerged out of the fellowship that he held here at the JCB. It is called Spanish Dollars and Sister Republics, The Money That Made Mexico and the United States, where I imagine fire appears only rarely in its pages, if at all. But really the focus of his work is on fire and Mexico. He spent years as a forest fighter, and hopefully in his description and presentation of the exhibition will not set fire to any of the objects here in the library. Forgive the extended introduction, but what I wanted to do is to really give the word over to our panelists, and with that I will invite Andrew Scherer to give the first presentation.
I'd like to thank both Neil and Lenore for organizing this event. It's a real honor to be here with you all. And hopefully we'll move through things fast enough. If you're holding tickets to Young Thug afterwards, you'll have a chance to go see him at the conclusion of the event. So what I must do before I get started is to acknowledge sort of where I'm coming from with sort of my own background research with fire, and acknowledge some of my collaborators. Some of this goes back, amazing to think, 7 years now, with a collaborative project at El Zotes in Guatemala, and I want to acknowledge especially Stephen Houston, Sarah Newman, Edwin Roman, and Thomas Garrison. And I'll be touching a little bit on El Zotes, and it's one of these great early spectacular fire temples that we have in the Maya early classic. Whoops, I'm going the wrong direction. And then I must also acknowledge collaboration with a colleague of mine, Vera Tiesler, in organizing a conference at Dumbarton Oaks just a couple of years ago. That's now, the proceedings of that volume are forthcoming, and that's Smoke, Flame, and the Human Body in Mesoamerican Ritual Practice. So a lot of the ideas I'm giving you today have been sort of touched upon within those collaborations. And I'll be focusing primarily on the Maya, and this is sort of the Maya world there, Eastern Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and Belize, and focusing especially on the classic period, AD 250 to 900, though I will be sort of extending on into the post-classic and even on into the historic, on up to the present in my discussion. And what I want to do is just give you a sort of thin sort of overview of some of what I see as the most salient or important themes of fire among the Maya. And this is by no means extensive or exclusive, but my goal was to get us sort of thinking about fire and fire from an indigenous perspective to really lay the groundwork for the later speakers. And I hope to move through this somewhat quickly because I'm always at Brown. You can come hear me some other time, and instead, better to hear from our invited guests. And so I wanted to start with just the very theme of this event, which is sort of the notion of fire as generative, but I've also put up there that it's also destructive. And this is, of course, the inherent paradox of fire that was very much recognized by indigenous peoples of the Americas, and certainly true of the Maya. And I've put up here photos of that sort of paradox of generation and destruction with a photo of a modern milpa, or a modern cornfield from Chiapas, Mexico. It's the very act of burning the forest is the first step in laying down the milpa, planting the seeds that are going to be the crops to feed people over the course of the year. And so there you can see that very much in action. But it's not merely agricultural activities that we see these paradoxes of fire. It's also the very sort of production of goods and also the destruction of goods. And so I put up there the scene of the exchange of ceramic materials from classic period Calakmul, but then also contemporary shrines in the Quiché, in this case from the community of Momos Tenango, where smashed and burned ceramic vessels are located at shrines that surround the community. And so again, it's these notions of these cycles of destruction and regeneration that are very sort of essential to the Maya, and fire is sort of the binding sort of force therein. Fire also has an important temporal component, and it's especially the conceptual linkage of fire to the sun. They're sort of very closely linked. They're in some sense one and the same. And for the Maya, we see fire symbolism especially closely linked to the concept of Kin, which is both the sun and the day. And so there's the glyph for Kin there. And we see this, for example, also embodied in a supernatural being, Kinichahau, the Sun Lord, and his head can double in as the Kin sign in classic Maya inscriptions. And so what you're looking at here, is this a laser? Yeah. So what you're looking at here is one of these famous long count dates, and in the fifth position is the position for Kin or day, and you've got the sun god's head doubled in there. Here's the sun god in his full sort of splendor, and you can see his skin is marked by these Kin signs. It marks him as a solar entity, but he is just one of a range of solar or fiery beings that are sort of different variants of one another. They have attributes in common with one another, but they have also attributes that set them apart. And I put in here one of those variants, which is the jaguar god of the underworld. It is the night sun. It is the evening version of the sun god. And you see here is a yet poorly understood myth among the classic Maya, which is where these young, or at least here, only one of them, I've cut the other one off, these young, this pair of young youths, these twins, are about to set the jaguar god of the underworld on fire in this interesting ritual that we see both mythologically played out, but it is also something that the Maya did to their captives as well. Recreating this myth was to light these captives on fire. Fire also has an important alimentary component, and John Monahan, among others, have noted that sort of underlying so much of Mesoamerican ritual is this notion of feeding, that we are bound, that humans are bound in covenants with these supernaturals, and the primary sort of job of humans in this covenant is to make sure the supernaturals are fed. This means not only spirit beings, God beings, but also the ancestors. And one of the primary ways that they are fed are through the forces of smoke and flame. So smoke is one of the primary food sources that's consumed, and then also other foods that are fed to them are burned and transformed into the smoke that is then consumed. And we see this today, for example, in the burning of candles. And so this is the Rila Mam from Santiago Atitlan in Guatemala. And he gets fed various substances, cigarettes, alcohol, in this case also candles that are lit before him. And there's a lot of symbolism about what particular candles are burned, what the colors mean, and these notion that some candles are fattier and they're likened to meat than others. Now, in pre-Columbian times, there were no candles, right? This is an introduction by the Spanish, but probably the most important substance that was fed to the supernatural beings was pulm or copal. It's basically a resin of a tree, and you can see here actual modeled copal that's pre-Columbian in origins that was recovered from the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza in northern Yucatan. That's now, you can see that's curated at the Peabody Museum up at Harvard. And we see graphic representations of poem as well. This is actually a hieroglyphic text showing full-bodied images, and we see this interesting figure here clutching poem in his hand. And this right there we would read that glyph as poem. So the contemporary word for poem we can trace back into pre-Columbian times. We also find reference to the acts of scattering this poem, and here we have this passage from a text from Stela from Ishtutz that reads Uchak wa Chehi, he scatters drops of incense for smoke. And the reason why I put that is I especially call attention to that term right there, Chahi, which we find also in colonial period and contemporary texts as cha, gota de resin de arbol, so a drop of resin from a tree. Or cha as, or chayil is also as smoke, and chate as scents in Tseltal, in contemporary Tseltal. And we also see it in early colonial dictionaries as chahil, umo. So there's this word cha and variants thereof that relate to smoke, incense, and burning. And when we look at classic period texts, this actually appears as a title that's used by various Maya lords and ladies, and the title is Cha Hom, and here you can see the title is Yokol Cha Hom, which is basically the head or the top Cha Hom. And we see it here also as a full-bodied glyph. This is the Cha Hom glyph, and this individual is clutching both incense, you can see there, and then also that keen sign, that sign for sun or that sign for day. And what's interesting is we see this as a common title taken by Maya kings and queens, the Cha Hom title. And earlier on, epigraphers just assumed this was a variant for ahau, the word for lord or king. But what we're really seeing here is probably a sort of a priestly title that highlights the double functioning of these Maya lords and ladies. So here you can see that Cha Hom title on Yaxchilan Lintel 3 used by the Yaxchilan king Itzamna Balam IV. And we see it also used by one of the queens of Yaxchilan, Lady Kabal Shok. And what's important that I've highlighted here is she's not scattering or burning incense, she's actually engaged in the act of bloodletting. So highlighted here is a ceramic dish. It's got paper with blood drops on it, and it has the implements of bloodletting, a stingray spine, and obsidian blades. And what's happening, what you're seeing here is a very stylized depiction of smoke rising up from this skull that she's showing and then revealing a sort of supernatural being that's a patron of the Yaxchilan royal court. So the idea is that this title, Cha Hom, not only refers to the act of burning or using incense, but it can be extended also to the very acts of bloodletting and burning of bloodletting paper. We also find the actual implements in which objects were burned at Maya archaeological sites. So this is from our own research zone where you see these spiked sensors that were used for burning substances, and it's not always clear exactly what those substances are. So here you can see a version of that spiked sensor with a sort of strange supernatural face on the side of it, and inside is the kindling, so that's what these long structures there are, is the kindling, and then embedded there is a structure that we still don't really know what that is. Some folks would interpret that as a ball of poem or this ball of kopan. Other people think this might actually be a depiction of a human heart with then this implement embedded within it, which might either be a sacrificial blade or a bundle of feathers. We also see that very same object protruding from the chest of a sacrificial victim. And in this case, it's a sacrificial victim as a young child, and embedded within there is this substance that we still don't know what it is. But again, all of these are united by the idea that there are things that are burned, and in this case, it's especially a conceptual continuity between the resins of trees, blood, and human hearts as things that are burned and then used to feed and sustain supernatural beings. This idea, again, that humans are bound to supernatural beings through these covenants. And we also see actual depictions of supernatural beings seated before dishes of human hearts. And so this is the sun god from the Temple of the Jaguars at Chichen Itza, and it's right here is the ceramic dish with the dish of hearts. Or again here we've got another supernatural being, the sun god again seated before a dish with human hearts. So he's a consumer of human hearts. Now, another theme that we see in smoke and flame among the Maya is that in some contexts it's very well defined, that they're very explicit in how they think about smoke, fire, and flames. But in other contexts, it's much more ambiguous. And we see this especially in the epigraphy, where there's very specific terms that describe different types of fire. So pulyi is an act of burning, but it's very specifically an act of burning with underlying violent intentions. This is the act of burning that you use to burn enemies, that you use to burn sacrificial victims. And here's just a variant of that same ceremony that I showed you earlier, in which case the jaguar god of the underworld is being burned by these young youths. And the verb right there, the poulier, is highlighted with the square. But there's other types of fire as well, as til, which is a more benign form of fire. And this seems to specifically refer to the sacred or supernatural fires that are lit within side of temples, that are lit especially on certain calendrical dates and mark important passages of time. And they especially also belong to gods, so certain gods become patrons of that particular form of fire. And we also see it as embedded or embodied in actual human beings. And so this is a king from the side of Naranjo, and his name is Coctilhuil Chanchok, and that's basically fire that burns the sky, rain god. Chok is the rain god. And so we see this very close connection between fire and these lords and ladies, and also the power thereof of fire. And this is his name actually written epigraphically, but also embedded in his headdress right there. And you can see the smoke and flame coming out. And in some cases, fire in the iconography is quite explicit. So here's, again, the glyph for fire, Kak, over there, and it's especially identifiable by this sort of, this volute and this sort of tight scroll. And you can see it here as this hunting god is holding a torch, and it's, again, that very same sort of sign. And in this case, explicitly sort of smoke or flame. But we see that symbolism also appear in other contexts where its significance or meaning is less clear. So Maya death gods have the same sort of curl and volute coming out of the abdomen, but in this case it seems to allude to a noxious odor or a nasty scent that spews from the abdomen. But in other cases, sweet floral scents are also illustrated in the same fashion. In this case, it's a stylized flower, and coming out of the petals of the flower is this beautiful, sweet scent. And so there's this idea that when the Maya are showing fire, they're alluding to something more than fire, that they're alluding to these sort of essences that exist, and there's the spectrum of essences that range from smoke and flame to sweet scents of flowers to the more noxious fumes that spew from the abdomens of death gods. Now, shifting as well to another fundamental paradox we see is that fire is both sort of quotidian and mundane. It's everyday things that we see, that are seen and used, but that they're also episodic and can relate to spectacles. And so in this case, I put it in just images of the cooking fire, and especially the three-stone hearth that symbolize for the Maya, it's one of the sort of conceptions of the center of the universe, the axis mundi, the very hearth that's within the kitchen fire. But there's other cases that fire very much becomes spectacle, and it's especially spectacle on rare and specific occasions. And again, I put in here this Piedras Negras Stela 11, which shows a lord seated upon a scaffold. There's a sacrificial victim before him, and long-term, for the longest time, the thinking was that this is a scene of his enthronement, that this is him going to the throne. But the actual text seems to refer to actually the first period ending at the end of his reign. And specifically, this is one of these 20-year periods that are conventionally known as the Katun, although we now read it as the Wenik Hab. And so it's a celebration of this end of this 20-year period. And it's conflating sort of his accession or his kingship with the completion of these important, great cycles of time that pass every 20 years. And what's interesting is there's very parallel symbolism that was found at this temple structure that was excavated at my colleagues at El Zotz. And this is just the structure there. That's an earlier construction underneath that pyramid there. And what's interesting is there's a stucco facade that goes around this building, and it shows the sun god in all of his variant guises. So you see him as both Kinichihau, the sort of the ascendant sun god. You see him as the jaguar god of the underworld, and you also see him as a variant of him rising in the eastern sea. And what's important is, I don't have the actual images. Oh, no, actually I do. Well, you can sort of see it. And so here's the Kinichihau here. And here's the jaguar god of the underworld. And what's important is they're also shown as blood drinkers, and I can't go into the sort of the iconography in the interest of time, but they're seen as specifically consumers of blood, if not human flesh. And what's intriguing is that this site was both the site of a royal tomb, but it was also the site of human sacrifice. And so within these ceramic dishes, these lidded ceramic dishes, both within the tomb and surrounding the burial site, where these sacrificed offerings of these children that show exposure to fire. And they're not cremated, they're not cremation offerings, but they're children that were placed in ceramic vessels in which burning was happening, and very much replicates that scene we see on that stela from Piedras Negras of that sacrificed youth with the substance that was placed inside the abdomen and the burning that surrounded him or her. And you can see that right here. And what's interesting is the scaffolding, part of what I've highlighted here in red, has a very distinctive motif to it. So it's this diagonal line with these little curls that are coming off of it, which Karl Taube interprets as evidence that these are bamboo, that this is bamboo scaffolding. Another way of interpreting it is it might be sort of pointing to or alluding to the smoke or the fire that would be produced by the burning of the scaffolding. And the idea is that that scene from the Piedras Negras Stela 11 is almost certainly at the very end of that ceremony, that entire scaffold would be lit on fire, sort of recognizing that conflation between these kings, fire, smoke, and ultimately the dawn or the new rising at the end of that old period and the start of the new period. And there you can just see is the same motif actually on the stucco that adorns that building. Now, what I would finally like to do is just simply highlight that when we look at concepts of fire among the Maya, we can certainly identify these continuities that can be traced all the way up to the present. And in an excellent book that just recently came out just this year by Alan Christensen, he looks at some of the ceremonies that are conducted, especially in and around during Holy Week in Santiago Atitlan in Guatemala, and it identifies elements of these ceremonies that clearly go back to pre-Columbian times. And among those is a 5-day period at the very end of the calendar that in pre-Columbian times among the Maya was known as the Wayeb. It's a dangerous time period that marks the end of the year, so it's the last 5 days in the 365-day solar calendar, and it's a period of destruction and renewal. And it's especially a period of destruction and renewal by fire. You clean out the house, you burn the old garbage, and then it culminates with a new fire ceremony, the lighting of a very new fire. It's something that we're going to hear a little bit about later from Guilhem. So in this case, we have clear sort of evidence of continuities, and here's just an illustration of that new fire ceremony that's still performed to this day in Santiago Atitlan. But on the other hand, we also have to recognize that there's these discontinuities. And I especially want to call attention to the ethnographic work of Pedro Pitarch, who works among the Tzeltal in Chiapas. And when I invited Pedro to participate in this conference that we held at Dumbarton Oaks a couple of years ago, I was like, okay, the theme is smoke and fire. Can you talk about that? And Pedro was like, well, they're not really into fire at all among the Tzeltal. And it's like, well, what about all those candles and incense? I mean, that's sort of part of the spectrum. I'm talking sort of fire in the big perspective. And Pedro was like, okay, fine, there's something there. But at the same time, one of the things that Pedro did was call attention to the fundamental different relationship that he saw among contemporary Tzeltal and fire than what we saw among the classic Maya and fire, and especially as it relates to notions of power and embodiment related to sort of kingly individuals. So I'm just going to end with a quote from Pedro from his forthcoming chapter in our book, in which he concludes that the spirits, God's dead souls and other beings from the other side, basically the other side, the other world, move within a wide range of fever and cold, of noise and silence. The shaman's actions, that is, the Chabahomatik, that is the Tzeltal shamans, the silencers, the extinguishers, basically how Pedro interprets them, are intended precisely to fix or at least reduce this oscillation between extremes, to reduce heat and cold, to diminish noise and absolute silence. In other words, in the Chiapas highlands, the shamanic use of fire consists not so much in the appropriating and making use of it, that is, taking advantage of its transformative capacity, as to try to reduce its power, to tame it, so to speak. In fact, as has been noted before, the shamanic use of fire is essentially limited to the use of candles and incense, that is, small offerings whose function is to maintain communication with the other side, but not to abduct its power in a radical way. Thank you.
Yeah, it's Liebmann. Yeah. Great, thanks. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. I'm already learning a lot. So I work a little bit north of where Andrew does in New Mexico. And so for those of you who've been coming to this series all along, I understand that you heard Bob Purcell last week talk about the Cerro Grande fire, and that's exactly where I'm going to pick up in this presentation. On June 26th in 2011, I was driving my pickup truck from Jemez Springs to Los Alamos, New Mexico, along Highway 4, which you see here. And I left Jemez Springs right around 12:30, and so I arrived in Los Alamos at around 1:30. And at 1 o'clock, somewhere along that journey, very near my truck, apparently, it was a windy day, and unbeknownst to me, a pine tree blew down, a ponderosa pine blew down on an electric line, and it ignited a wildfire. So when I reached Los Alamos, I got out of my truck and I turned around literally to put some gas in the truck, and I looked back and I saw this giant plume of smoke rising up behind me. So as I mentioned, the downed tree had sparked this massive wildfire that became known as the Cerro Grande fire. In the first 12 hours of this fire, it burned 43,000 acres, and so that's a rate of about 1 acre per second, which gives you a sense of how fast it was going. It was New Mexico, like much of the American West, was in the middle of a massive drought at the time, and so the preconditions were set up in the forest to promote this really massive fire, which you can see here, just how big the smoke plume was. So this is northern New Mexico here, and it's spreading all the way across the Texas Panhandle and Oklahoma here, so you can get a sense of the scale of this fire. Eventually, the fire burned over 244 square miles of northern New Mexico, making it, at the time, the largest wildfire in New Mexico state history. But it's actually part of a larger pattern that's been occurring over the past 20 years, in which there have been a series of largest wildfires in New Mexico history, starting in 2000 in this same area. With this one, 2011. In 2012, there was another even larger one that usurped this fire and took the title of largest fire in New Mexico history. And these fires were and continue to be especially concerning for the Pueblo peoples of northern New Mexico, because in addition to destroying the forests and all the natural resources that accompany the forest, this destroys the areas in which their ancestors had dwelled for centuries. It lays waste to their traditional shrines, their hunting areas, pilgrimage areas, trails that they've been trotting for 7, 8 centuries or more. And then in the wake of these fires, it causes extensive flooding, erosion, damage to archaeological sites. So the loss to heritage and natural resources is really incalculable. So what this photograph is showing you is Taos Pueblo in northern New Mexico, and these are people sitting on their rooftops. Pueblo, I'll get into a little description of the Pueblos in just a second here, but Pueblo people known for this apartment-style dwelling, and they're watching the flames just on the outskirts of Taos Pueblo. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the area, this is northern New Mexico, home to 19 Pueblo villages today. I'm going to use the term Pueblo interchangeably here, both to mean tribe of people. So each one of these dots represents an individual tribe, a tribe of Pueblo Indians. But a Pueblo is also a physical place. The town in which they dwell is called the Pueblo. So you see these here. If you've been to the area, here's Santa Fe, the state capital. Albuquerque is between Sandia and Isleta down here. So if you're fans of Breaking Bad, they go out here to cook the meth, and this is what this area is probably most famous for today. My work takes place with Jemez Pueblo here, and so the images you were just seeing were from the fire up in the northern part of these mountains, the green area behind Santa Clara and San Ildefonso. And it burned an area all the way down here from Cochiti Pueblo in the south all the way up past Okeowinge and up near Taos in the north. So again, if you're not familiar with the area, Pueblo peoples are famous for, among other things, the pottery, that they make. If you've been to Santa Fe, you've probably seen Pueblo artisans sitting at the Palace of the Governor selling their wares, or if you're lucky, you've maybe attended one of the feast days that takes place in the Pueblos throughout northern New Mexico today. I myself have been working with Jemez Pueblo for about 17 years now, and one characteristic that the Pueblo people share, I should mention there's a lot of diversity within what we call the Pueblos. There are 6 different mutually unintelligible languages that are spoken among them today, but they share similarities in their material culture, their architecture, and broadly in some of their religious practices. So this is a photograph of Zia Pueblo as it looks today. You can see they still have a central plaza, so most Pueblos are organized around a central plaza. There is the 17th century mission church down here, and then if you look this is actually looking from north to south, so this is the south end of the Pueblo. You see these 2 circular buildings are their kivas. They're religious, these are specialized religious chambers, architecture. And the reason there are 2 is these societies have moital social organizations. So one of these is the raven kiva, and the other is the turquoise kiva that correspond to the two moieties. While these recent wildfires have caused irreparable damage to traditional Pueblo landscapes, Pueblo people's relationships with fire have not always been so negative. In fact, it appears as though Pueblo peoples have long regarded fire as a beneficial force and often a rejuvenating force. So in the Pueblos, especially in Tewa and Carey's Pueblos, they refer to fire using literally flowery language. And this is actually picking right up on Andrew's presentation. So they refer to flame metaphorically as a blossom. So Elsie Clues Parsons tells us in her massive tome on Pueblo Indian religion that it would be common for a man in a Tewa Kiva who wants a bark torch to light a cigarette. He would call out, "Someone bring me a flower." And that's the word they use for the flame to light his cigarette. Tewa hunters also pray to a spirit before the hunt named Fire Flower Woman. So there's a lot of shared flower imagery and fire imagery that I think also relates to this notion that fire has to do with fertility and rejuvenation. Here you see the burning of a Hopi field in preparation for planting in 2013. And so fire is conceptually linked to fertility, to fostering new life, to growth beyond the ashes. Again, much like in Andrew's presentation, we saw the burning in preparation for the fields. Well, they do the same thing up at Hopi. This is rarely done, at least where I work in the Rio Grande these days, because of the fire danger that these kinds of brush fires could take off and cause another Cerro Grande fire. And this conceptual link between fire and fertility is maybe most famously embodied by the Zuni spirit Chulawitsi, also known as the little Firekeeper. You can see here in this Kachina doll, Chulawitsi carries a firebrand in his right hand that's used to start fires along a trail in which different members of the tribe travel as a pilgrimage, both around this time of the summer solstice and the time of the winter solstice. And so Chulawitsi, we're told, lights fires along this trail, and the rising smoke is thought of as clouds. So in Matilda Cox Stevenson's ethnographic reporting of her stay among the Zunis in the 1880s, she notes that the ceremony actually begins by a group going out with Chulawitsi. Chulawitsi is actually usually embodied by a younger male in the village, a 10 to 12-year-old man, and they start a fire using friction, so literally rubbing the sticks together, and then they light the firebrand of Chulawitsi, but they take the sticks and throw them into a spring with a prayer for rain. So again, we see this, in the Pueblos, rain is everything. The crops need rain to grow, so we see this conceptual link between fire and agricultural fertility. And Stevenson says that after throwing the sticks in the spring, this is a quote, Chulawitsi runs about setting fire to the grass, the trees, or whatever comes in his way, that smoke may rise in clouds like the breath from the gods. So Chulawitsi is this spirit who's associated with fire, also with hunting and with maize, and so he's intimately implicated in these notions of fertility. And his participation in hunting, planting, and harvesting rituals reminds Pueblo peoples of the rejuvenating effects of fire. Now, nearby at Acoma Pueblo, also known as Sky City, this may be hard to see if you're not familiar with the area, but Acoma Pueblo is famous because it's this mesa top refuge. So the village is built on top of this giant stone mesa. And there, every 5 years, a ceremony takes place wherein 4 Kachinas are sent in 4 directions out from the Pueblo to travel to the 4 mountain peaks that define the Acoma world. And at sunrise, they light fires and build fires all along the trail as they return to the Pueblo the next day. And we're told that when they reach the Pueblo, so that none of the people will misunderstand their actions, the Kachinas explain to the people that they do not burn the ground to destroy the world, but in their words, to heat the earth, which makes it more fertile. So again, we have these ties between fire and fertility. However, due to the threat of the devastating wildfires in New Mexico over the past 15 years, this ceremony has been curtailed. So I'm told that they haven't practiced it for the last 3 cycles because of the wildfire danger in New Mexico. So clearly, based on that example, Pueblo people's relationships with fire have changed in recent years. And I recently wrapped up a 4-year collaborative research project with colleagues from the University of Arizona, from SMU, and from Simon Fraser University, as well as the Pueblo of Jemez Department of Natural Resources, in which we investigated the long-term history of Pueblo people's relationships with fire. And we are focusing particularly on how these relations were affected by the introduction of European colonialism. So again, we partnered with Jemez on this, and so we were looking in the Ponderosa pine forest here in the Jemez Mountains, north of the Pueblo. So this is the landscape that we're talking about. You can see it's a high desert climate. The Jemez region is famous for these deep valleys surrounded by these high flat-topped mesas. And in the past, in the 17th century and earlier, the Jemez people built their villages largely on these mesa tops. So for this research project, we were focusing particularly on the pueblos that were inhabited right immediately before the earliest European contact in the region. The first, I shouldn't say European contact, the first Old World contact in the region, because famously in the Pueblos, the first contact was made in 1539 by an enslaved Moor named Esteban, who led ahead of a Franciscan friar. So the Pueblos have a phrase that they love to repeat. They say, the first white man we met was a black man. And that was Esteban the Moor. So that happens in 1539 at Zuni Pueblo. So we were particularly interested in what happens across the pre-contact colonial period divide in this project. So the Pueblos you can see here, at that time we're living in about, the ancestral Jemez people living in about 18 large Pueblo villages scattered around those mesa tops. And these villages varied in size. We estimate the populations at the smallest one to be about 30 people, all the way up to 4 Pueblos that had populations of probably around 1,500 people at the time. Just to give you an idea of what those villages would have looked like, again, not that dissimilar from what we saw at Zia Pueblo today. So it's this multi-storied, plaza-oriented architecture. You can see in this reconstruction, these are the kivas in those plazas there. And so we wanted to study how these people had lived in this very fire-prone region for 700 years and what the pattern of wildfire was both before and after the introduction of Spanish colonialism in the region. So we did this by going out, and when I say we, I mean my colleagues from the University of Arizona Tree Ring Lab, went out and sampled trees on the site. But as archaeologists, when we study tree rings, we're usually interested in the wood samples that we're able to extract from the villages that we excavate, and the outer ring of those samples usually tells us something about the construction, because it tells you the year in which the tree was cut down. We decided for this project we wanted to look at the opposite. We actually wanted to look at when trees germinated and started growing on this landscape, because it gave us an idea about when people had moved off of the landscape presumably after the introduction of Spanish colonialism. So we went out and sampled sometimes dead and down stumps, old trees. This is a landscape that preserves wood very well. It's a very dry landscape. So we were actually able to find in some areas trees with initial growing dates going back all the way into the 1300s. They're not still alive. They were dead, but there were stumps down. But, and quite regularly, we were able to get trees in the 16th century and stretching back into the 15th that showed their initial growth. So they started as a sapling back around that time. So these are just 3 of the sites that we sampled. So what you're seeing here is a LiDAR image for the archaeologists in the room. You guys know what LiDAR is. For those that don't, a plane flies over and makes a really cool map of the site. And it's a highly detailed topographic map. So what you're seeing in this little square are the collapsed ruins of the architecture. So those Pueblo buildings that have collapsed. And so it's essentially a rubble mound. So you can see at 3 of these sites, these are all rubble mounds. The big circles are kivas. And each of these triangles represents a tree that we sampled to look at the growth rings in the tree. They're actually color-coded by decade, but that's a different paper that I'm not gonna bore you with today. But this is actually one of the samples that we took, and so you can see what my friends who work at the U of A do. Not only do they tell us the earliest dates that these start growing, and I can't read that here, 1635, I think this one is. And so in addition to telling us that date, the outer ring, you can see on this that ponderosa pines have this characteristics of recording fires that go through the area. So these trees will develop something called a fire scar. It has to do with the outer bark being damaged and then sap running down and it growing over. So in addition to telling us when trees started growing on this landscape, it gives us a history of the fires that came through on this landscape as well. So when we looked at that history, I want to mention here briefly, these fires are very different than the Cerro Grande fire and the kinds of fires we hear about on the national news today. These are what we call healthy fires. So these were fires that were burning out the undergrowth and allowing the forest and the trees to continue. So you can see why that would be associated with notions of fertility and positive thing. What happens today is these fires get too hot and there's too many trees growing too close together and the fire moves up into the canopy and that's what kills the forest and ends up with that picture like I showed you before where it's a dead landscape. So all these forest fires that I'm going to talk about actually promoted a healthy forest through the time. So when we looked at the fire record through the entire region, you can see this interesting pattern that shows up that prior to 1620 and certainly prior to 1650, there was one large-scale kind of regional forest fire happening about every 25 years. And something happens between 1620 and 1680, and I really think it's probably closest to 1640, 1650, where you see a shift in that, and we start to get one fire every 11 years, or sometimes at even smaller intervals. So we have a shift, something happens here where we get major fires happening much more frequently. And I also want to point out that you see right around 1890, we get almost none of those anymore, right? And this is, I'll come back to this in the conclusion, but this is not an error in the chart. This is real data. The forest fires stop happening during that period. So what happens that promotes this pattern that we have increased fires? Well, it's inherently implicated with Spanish colonialism in the region. But as I mentioned before, earliest contact happens in 1540. And so you can see the pattern doesn't change in 1540. And it doesn't even change in 1598 when the first permanent Spanish colonial settlements are erected. But we start to see bigger changes happening after 1620. And so I hope the question you're asking yourself right now is what happened in 1620? And the answer is, in 1620 involved the expansion of the Franciscan mission program in this region. So it was the establishment of large-scale mission facilities that ultimately, and here's a slide of the actual mission that's built in Jemez Springs at the Jemez site of Gisela in 1621 and 22. And The construction of these missions are what precipitated large-scale depopulation of the region. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this story about the introduction of old world diseases to native peoples and the devastating effects. But the interesting thing we found in this research was previous theories had suggested that those waves of epidemic disease should have been hitting starting possibly as early as 1540 and certainly earlier than 1620. But what we actually found was we think that at least in the Jemez region, that doesn't appear to be the case, that there appears to be continuity of settlement through the 1620s. And it's really between 1620 and 1680, we see a crash from around 6,500 people in this region down to 900 people by the end. So just to give you a sense of what that means, that's an 87% population loss. So I'm going to play a little game with you guys. I'm going to ask everybody to stand up for a second. Trust me, I won't call on you, I promise. All right? So this would represent 100% population. Now, everyone whose birthday falls between January 1st and February 16th, you remain standing. If your birthday comes February 17th or later, you sit. So that's an 87% population loss for this. So just to give you a sense, you guys can sit now, thank you. You guys lived through. But just think about what that would do to traditional knowledge, the culture as a whole, what the effects this would have. It's really remarkable the way Pueblo culture actually managed to remain intact despite this massive depopulation. But the other effect is that moves people out of those large villages on the mesa tops and allows the forest to regrow. So where they had been burning their fields and essentially denuding that area to a large extent, cutting trees for both their architecture, for the fuel, for heating and cooking, people leave the landscape and the forest regrows. And that's why we see it both fills in, so we get more widespread fires, and that's why we see that differential pattern. When people move off the landscape, we get these fires sweeping through again until 1890, when the fires stop. And that's a combination of, we think, two things. First of all, the introduction of sheep, which changes the local ecosystem. There were sheep before, but they really get introduced on a larger scale then. But even more so, it's the Smokey the Bear policies of the Forest Service at the time, when forests were seen as a resource, and so all forest fires were suppressed. And this both allowed fires not to burn, but that also didn't have those healthy fires that burned out the undergrowth. And so you got a century's worth of buildup of combustible material that has now resulted in these massive wildfires that we're seeing again and again, unfortunately, in New Mexico. So I'm going to wrap it up there and just say thank you again for listening so patiently.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation in this so nice place. I will speak about the new fire ceremony in ancient Mexico. It comes as no surprise that the process of converting the indigenous population following the conquest of Mexico faced a number of resistance movements. One of them was described in a Nahuatl chronicle from about 1582, the Anales de Juan Bautista. It tells of an Indian named Juan Teton, who in 1558 washed the heads of the inhabitants of Coatepec and Atlapulco in the Texcoco regions to cleanse them from the Christian baptism. At that time, Juan Teton also ominously announced the catastrophes that awaited the people. I quote, "You already know what our grandfathers used to say, that when the year count was bound, darkness would take over, and the tzitzimime would descend to eat us. And then there would be a transformation of the people. Those who were baptized and who believed in God will be transformed. Those who eat cow meat will turn into cows. Those who eat pig meat will turn into pigs. Those who eat sheep meat will turn into sheep. Now I do my duty for you, because soon a miracle will happen. And if you don't believe me, with this miracle you'll be transformed. The commoners must dry the pulque, agave wine. With it they will save them when they go to Chapultepec. And when the Tlantepusilama sees them, she will be afraid and will not eat them. This text in Nahuatl demonstrated that by that time, around 1558, the memory of the new fire ceremony was still alive, along with the fear of the descent of the tzitzimime, which were nocturnal female creatures that would devour people at the end of time. Various transformations of Christians were predicted, as well as the apparition of a little-known goddess, Tlantepusilama. When Juan Teton spoke of our grandfathers, used to say that when the year count was bound, darkness would take over, he was referring to a ceremony of supreme importance celebrated by the ancient Nawa every 52 years, namely the New Fire Ceremony, or Xiomolpili, the binding of the years. To understand the temporal dimensions of the celebration, it is necessary to bear in mind that the peoples of ancient Mexico used two different calendars. A solar calendar consisting of 365 days and a ritual calendar of 260 days. And these two calendars coincided every 52 years, which corresponded to an indigenous century. During the reign of Tlatoani, or King Moctezuma II, the great ceremony of the binding of the years was celebrated in 1507 because it coincided with the end of a 52 years cycle. Therefore, the next cycle will end in 1559, and we can understand that Juan Teton, a year earlier, announced the impending Xiomolpili and the possible catastrophes that would befall the indigenous people under the yoke of Christianity. Fortunately, various descriptions of the New Fire celebration carried out in 1507 have come down to us, in particular, the version provided in Nahuatl by the indigenous collaborators of Franciscan Friar Bernardino de Sahagún. In his general history of the things of New Spain, he explained when the date came to bind the years, in preparation, the people put out all fires in the city, those in the temples and palaces, as well as those in private homes. Statues of the gods kept in homes were shattered, along with all domestic utensils. However, the New Fire ceremony was actually performed on a hill called Huixachtlan, today known as Cerro de la Estrella, Star Hill, near the capital city, Mexico, Tenochtitlan. When night fell, the priests, dressed as goats, slowly approached the hill. Their numbers included a special priest, a fire priest who was experienced to drill the new fire, who was in charge of lighting the new fire upon the breast of a war captive at midnight. Sagun's Nawa collaborator described the mood of anguish that prevails at these times. I quote, "All were frightened and filled with dread. Thus was it said. It was claimed that if fire could not be drowned, then the sun would be destroyed forever. Night will prevail forever, and the Titsimime, demons of darkness, will descend to eat men." As a result, the people went up to the roof of their homes and donned masks made of agave leaves to protect themselves. In addition, pregnant women were hidden away in granaries with armed warriors stationed nearby, because it was believed that these women would be transformed into savage beasts and devour human beings. Similarly, children were not allowed to sleep, as adults shouted at them, shaking and poking them. I quote, "Because if they were to sleep, it was thought they would turn into mice. They would become mice." Terrified and in the dark, the entire population gazed expectantly at the hill of Huizachtlan. There, on the summit, the priest proceeded to light the new fire on the breast of a special captive. As soon as the fire was drilled, then speedily the priest slashed open the breast of the captive, seized his heart, and quickly cast it then into the fire. When they finally saw the anxiously awaited light on the hill, all the people drew blood from their earlobes and scattered it towards the site where the new fire had been lit. So deep was their devotion that, I quote, "Although the child still lay in the cradle, they also cut his ears, took his blood, and spattered it towards the fire." The priest then returned to Mexico City with the highly prized fire from the hill. They headed straight to the temple of Huitzilopochtli, the patron god of the Aztecs. From there, the fire was distributed to the other temples, the palaces, the schools, and then to the homes of the commoners. In a mood of elation and joy, old household goods were discarded and replaced by new utensils, including earthstone and the people's clothing. Also at that time, the men were newly dressed and wrapped in capes, and women dressed newly in their new skirts and shirts. Although the text does not specify it, the statues of gods were no doubt replaced by new ones as well. At noon, copal was offered to the fire, quails were decapitated, and captives were sacrificed. In his chronicle, Franciscan Benavente or Motolinia states that 400 captives were sacrificed on this occasion. To better understand the temporal and cosmogonic context surrounding the celebration of the new fire ceremony, it is essential to take into account the cyclic conception of history of the people of ancient Mesoamerica. In fact, ancient myths explain how 4 or 5 ages, also known as suns, had preceded our current age. In this belief system, each sun was dominated by a deity, Chalchiutlicue, Quetzalcoatl, Xiuhtecutli, and Xochiquetzal, gods representing water, wind, fire, and earth. Each of these era or sun ended in a great cataclysm, and the last age, the one in which we currently live, is destined to end with an earthquake. Some sources mention that humans were transformed based on the particular type of destruction that befell them. They became fish during the flood, monkeys during the hurricanes, butterfly, dogs, and turkeys during the rain of fire. Therefore, we can understand why Juan Teton announced the imminent transformation of Christians and the Indians who followed their customs into animals associated with the Spaniards, such as cow, sheep, and pigs. The process of transformation into animals at the ends of the cosmic cycles or suns is also reflected in the fears of the Mexicas during the 1507 New Fire Ceremony, in which pregnant women and children were particularly vulnerable to being metamorphosed into savage beasts and mice, respectively. This fear of the potential transformation of women takes us back to the prediction made by Juan Teton, who mentioned a little-known goddess, Tlantepusilama, a Nahuatl name that could be translated as elderly woman with copper teeth. This goddess is the equivalent or form part of the Tzitzimime. Frightening, right? Who Sagun informants describes when they say, it was claimed that if fire could not be drowned, then the sun will be destroyed forever, and the Tzitzimime would descend to eat men. Their depiction in codices display skeletal figures with a knife or spurt of blood coming from the mouth, with sharp claws and their hands and feet. Written sources relate the Tzitzimime to the Cihuateteo, female deities that were the embodiment of women who died in childbirth. It was said that the Cihuateteo accompanied the sun on its journey from the zenith to sunset. On certain dates, the Cihuateteo descended to earth, where they caused fear in the people and transmitted diseases. As for Tlantepusilama, the goddess mentioned by Juan Teton, little is known of her, and the classic works of Sahagún, Durán, and Motolinia do not mention her at all. Nevertheless, she can be found in our historical and ethnographic account from the 16th century to the 21st century in a territory spanning the state of Durango in the north to Chiapas in the south. For example, in the Mixtec Codex, Nutal, a gloss that reads Tlantepusilamatl, appears beside a fire serpent. In fact, the fire serpent corresponds to a dangerous Nahual that is described nowadays in the Mixteca as a ball of fire, which is what a witch turns into when she is about to suck the blood of newborns. Tlantepusilama is also portrayed as a witch in an epic poem, El Peregrino Indiano, by Antonio de Saavedra y Guzmán, published in 1599. In this case, the account describes how the Tlaxcaltec leader Maxicatzin, opposed to an alliance with the Spaniards, consulted Tlantepusilama in a cave to find out about the future of Tlaxcala. Child sacrifice in her honor are mentioned among the soques of Chiapas at the end of the 17th century. Finally, in the early 20th century, the Mexicaneros of Durango told German anthropologist Konrad Theodor Preuss various stories featuring the terrifying goddess Tepusilam. She lives in the forest, and as the master of wild animal, she can adopt the appearance of a deer, of an eagle, or a cayman. Tepusilamen appears as devourer of little girls and men, capable of penetrating the earth to reach her victims. Finally, tired of her misdeeds, the townspeople invite the goddess to a celebration where she became drunk, and she was thrown into a bonfire. The characteristic of Tlantepusilama, including her connection with metal, highlight her similarity to Itzpapalotl, obsidian butterfly, an avatar of the earth goddess. Her appearance in Juan Teton prophecy, in the framework of the new fire ceremony, enables us to equate Tlantepusilama with the fearful Tzitzimime. We observed a symbolic equivalence between the 52-year cycle and the cosmogonic ages that took place from the origin of time. A number of indigenous sources claim that the arrival of the Spaniards was seen as the start of a new age. The age dominated by Huitzilopochtli and Tezcatlipoca. Aztec patron deities had come to an end, and the newcomers, the Spaniards, were identified as the envoys of Quetzalcoatl, the fever serpent. They came to recover the kingdom of the fever serpents, the king of Tolan, who has been cast out by Tezcatlipoca, his enemy twin. This context suggests why some sources claim that King Moctezuma II died at the age of 52 years, although we know that he was probably younger when he passed away. Instead, the supposed age of his death coincided with an indigenous century. Furthermore, the interpreter of the Codex Tudela linked the new fire ceremony to the prediction of the arrival of the Spaniard and the fall of the Mexica Empire. I quote, "The year that Cortés entered in this land, when they wanted to make the new fire, they could not do so for 3 days, and they viewed this as a omen that the land would be lost." Returning to the symbolism of the figure of 52 years, it is said that the reign of Quetzalcoatl in Tolan was 52 years, and the same age was attributed to the famous Mixtec king 8 Deer Jaguar Claw, who was identified with the fever serpent when he was assassinated after creating a great empire in the region of Oaxaca. New fire was also lit during accession rites and vows of entry into the nobility. For example, the future Tecurtli, or noble in Tlaxcala, I quote, had to light new fire with a stick from which it is made, and he had to make sure that the fire not die out during the day and at night for 30 days. A prominent part of the complex rites surrounding accession to power was the nose perforating ceremony, which was sometimes carried out on a sacrificial stone. This served to identify the future king as a sacrificial victim, the sovereign symbolically sacrificing himself to the gods for the benefits of his people. This ceremony of perforating the future ruler's nose was linked to the act of lighting new fire in a testimony in the Annales of Tecomachalco. I quote, "In this year, to read, Moctezuma perforated the septum of his nose when new fire was lit at Huixachtlan by binding the cycles of the years." Finally, and to delve more deeply into the significance of the new fire ceremony, the symbolism of the date to read should be emphasized, for it was a year chosen to carry out this ceremony. In fact, the first new fire was said to have been lit by Tezcatlipoca, precisely in a 2 years to read year. What's more, the year to read corresponded to the date of birth of Huitzilopochtli, the Aztecs' patron god. It was said that the god had been born at Coatepec Hill, where his mother, who had become pregnant after taking a bit of fever, happened to be. Furious, her daughter Coyolxauhqui and her sons, the Senson Huitznahuas, planned to kill their mother, so they set off to Coatepec. At that moment, Huitzilopochtli was born, fully armed, especially with a great weapon, the Xiuhcoatl or fire serpent, which he used to kill Coyolxauhqui and the Senson Huitznahua. This episode from the myth was reenacted every year during the feast of the 20-day month of Panquetzalistli. Now, the birth of Huitzilopochtli was equated to the birth of the sun, who defeated Coyolxauhqui, the moon, and the stars, identified with the Senson Huitznahua. The Mexicas chose precisely this 20-day period of Panquetzalistli in a two-reed year to carry out the new fire ceremony. Thus, the 400 captives sacrificed on this occasion corresponded to the 400 Huitznahua who were defeated by Huitzilopochtli in the myth. Therefore, during the binding of the years, Xiomolpili, the Aztec ritually recreated the sun, identified with Huitzilopochtli, their patron god, and contributed to the smooth functioning of the world machine endangered at the end of cosmic cycles. Thank you very much.
This is the end of no. No, it's not mine.
Oh, good.
Is
this one yours?
No, thank you at the beginning. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. So, in fact, thank you very much for this invitation to Lenore, to Neil, and to Tara. And I must say that it has been a very inspiring occasion for me. I think it's a very healthy intellectual challenge to think in terms of these broad challenges. No? Fire, air. I missed air last year, so I'm very happy to be here this year. And I would say that my brief contribution is a kind of meditation to this aspect that Neil mentioned at the beginning of this afternoon, this competition between humans and the combustive activity now, which is inherent to many different historical and geographical contexts, but perhaps which is very specific to the Americas, especially in the 16th century, where this process of conquest, which also went very fast, was also accompanied to, let's say, moments of possibility of seeing fire as a transformative creative power. So I just show you a little bit the logic and the plan of this contribution, to think in terms of this fire dilemma now between destruction and creation in three moments. Now these moments of fury, of fury of the conquest, where in fact fire is the destructive element par excellence. This second moment, which is before fury, before the fury of the conquistadors, the capacity to see beauty, and the third part will be the artistic control over fire. So it's a kind of meditation on these two aspects of fire. So I thought that a good place to start, because the Americas in the 16th century is not only the indigenous world, but is also the relationship to Europe. I thought that a good place to start would be the Codex Atlanticus of Leonardo da Vinci. You know that the Codex Atlanticus is this gathering of the notes of Leonardo da Vinci in his last 30 years of life, and it's dated up to 1519, which is for me a very, very interesting date, because to any American, 1519 is the arrival of the Spaniards to the coast of today Veracruz. So in the Codex Atlanticus, Leonardo da Vinci addresses in pages and drawings, mechanics, artillery, 4 elements, and he has a very, very interesting note. I read it in Italian, but it's translated. Nascerà questo il fuoco, nascerà questo di piccolo principio che si farà con prestezza grande. Questo non stimerà alcuna cosa creata, anzi con la sua potenza, quasi il tutto avrà in potenza di trasformare di suo essere in un altro. So I found inspiring that this note was perhaps not written in 1519, but it's current in 1519, when in fact the Spaniards arrived to the coast of Veracruz. And in this first part, I will show you some images. Guilhem already mentioned the Florentine Codex, which is this codex housed today in the Biblioteca Medici Laurenziana. We are in a library, so it's also nice to remember where these artifacts are, the Medici Laurenziana of Florence. And it's a massive and really masterpiece, and finished in the 1570s, so 50 years after the arrival of the Spaniards, gathered by these Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún with the collaboration of Nahua intellectuals, scribes, painters, and translators. So it's very interesting in the book 12 that Guilhem already mentioned it, that at the beginning of the book 12, which is a book devoted to the history, to the War of Conquest, to the history of the War of Conquest, that the Codex mentioned these omens that would have preceded the arrival of the Spaniards. It's in fact a retrospective narrative which the Nahuas probably forged in order to understand the ununderstandable, the arrival of the Spaniards. But it's very interesting that in the second omen, which he is in fact studied with all the other omens by Diana Magaloni, and it's very interesting because she mentions how these specific omens is the point of contact between prophecy and reality. Now, so the destruction of the temples, the firing of the temples. So if we read, the second omen is the flaring fire. A second omen came to pass here in Mexico. Quite of its own accord, fire broke out in the house of Huitzilopochtli and flared greatly. No one had set fire to it. Only of itself it burst into flames. And then it goes on mentioning that, in fact, it is a fire which is out of control. It's not only a fire which came from nowhere, but it's a fire that cannot be stopped. So we see, in fact, here the effort of trying to stop the fire, but it's an unstoppable fire. It's a fire which is out of control. The second image in the narration of the War of Conquest, which seems very pertinent to our discussion today, is a few pages later, where in fact it's represented the encounter between the Nahuas ambassador and the Spaniards, still on the boat. And it's very interesting because something ununderstandable for us at the beginning happened. The Mexican ambassadors offers gifts, and the image after, I don't know if I can use the pointer. Oops, no, it was not this. Okay, but you see here the Spaniards receive the objects, and in this image the first gunshot happened. And so it's something very, very much related. And one of the possible readings is that through these offerings, which were, among other things, feather offerings, the Cortés received the tonali, received this solar force which transformed himself into the conquistador, into this martial figure capable of, in fact, conquering Mexico. Another very important moment where fire is addressed in this book of the Conquest is when the Spaniards go through the smoking hill, which is the Popocatépetl. So in fact, they are capable of controlling fire. They are moving from the coast, from Veracruz, tierra adentro, so they are going to Mexico City, to the center, and they are in fact braving fire in some sense. Melting down fire is also represented in its force of melting down objects. So here we are already in the representation of the kernel moments of the conquest, when the Spaniards in fact use fire to melt down objects, for instance, feather objects, to recuperate metals, to recuperate gold and silver. So this is a very strong image of how fire is used also not only to destroy, but to melt down, literally, materials. And then this key image for me of the corps à corps, of the facing between Spaniards and Mexica, it's very interesting because the Codex of Florence mentions openly that this is one of the only images when it's only Spaniards and Mexica. It's not Spaniards and the Indian allies, it's Spaniards and Mexica. And the text says, in fact, exactly from the Nahuatl. And then some days later, 2 boats came there to Yautengo. The Spaniards came alone, proceeding in the early dawn. There were no allied Indian men. The Spaniards came quite alone. And upon this, when they had beached their boats, they thereupon leaped out on dry land. And when they had set forth on the firm ground, then they came giving battle. They went each firing guns and crossbows. And it's very interesting here because it's a symbolic image, right? It's not just the firing and the attack, but this gunshot is capable of destroying a temple, which of course is a symbolic image. No? So I found it's a quite powerful image representing really this face-to-face between the Spaniards and not only the Mexica, but the architecture. It's a face-to-face, not only the corps à corps, it's not only between the conquistador and the Mexica, but between the gun and the temple. And the final image, which I would just briefly to mention, is in fact the last image of the Florentine Codex, which ends, in fact, with the revelation of the prophecy, which is this destruction of the temple. And here it's interesting, the text in Spanish says, y el mismo día pusieron fuego al templo de Huitzilopochtli y todo se quemó en obra de 2 o 3 horas. 2 or 3 hours it goes. It's a comparable rhythm to the 1 acre per second. This is a build space. So 3 hours, it's finished. So the Nahuatl text of the same episode, it says, they burned the temple, they laid fire to it, and when they had set it afire, they flared it up. Very high rose the blaze, the tongue of flame. It was as if the fire roared and kept flaring up. And when the Tlatelolcas saw the temple was now burning, then there was weeping. There was tearful greetings, for it was thought that there would be plundering. So it's really the revelation of the prophecy, and it's the end of conquest, and the end, in fact, of Mexico City. So it's a sad story, of course, but I would like to counterbalance this vision. It's very paradoxical to see how, in fact, the source that helps us to think to the conquest in a different way comes from Hernán Cortés. Hernán Cortés is the conquistador that we saw gunshotting in one of the images of the Florentine Codex. And in the second letter of Hernán Cortés, which is written in 1520, while he's preparing the final attack to Mexico City, he's recalling the wonder of seeing the architectural beauty of the city. So it's a very, very paradoxical moment where the conquistador, he's outside of Mexico City. He's preparing the final attack, and he's recalling the pleasure and the astonishment of seeing this beautiful city. So it's putting kind of suspension the fire. So let's read briefly this quotation. There are in all districts of this great city many temples or houses for their idols. They are all very beautiful buildings. They are so well constructed in both their stone and woodwork that there can be none better in any place. For all the stonework inside the chapels where they keep their idols, is in high relief, with figures and little houses, and the woodwork is likewise of relief and painted with monsters and other figures and designs. So here, the partial conclusion that we could take from here is that, in fact, the architectural beauty of the city is capable of putting in suspension this destructive pyre of fire. And in fact, what is even more paradoxical is that it's the conquistador itself who, in fact, fictionally, because again, it's 1520, so he's preparing this final attack, but he's recalling this moment of astonishment in front of the beauty of the city. So we could say that, in fact, in the second letter, fire presents Cortés as a counter-conquistador. The fire is stopped by the beauty of the objects, in fact, that Cortés is even capable of seeing, even though just few seconds, minutes, or days after, everything will be destroyed. So, but there is this tension between the beauty and the destruction of fire. Along with images of the conquest, the Florentine Codex and other sources written and painted during the Iberian expansion addresses the other part of that we are addressing also here today of the transformative and generative powers of fire, which is the creative power. And specifically in the Florentine Codex is very interesting because before this book 12, there is this book 11, which is devoted partially to the artists, craftsmen, and there are these pages on the metal workers capable of having control over fire. So control over fire is, in fact, it's interesting here to compare the image of the artist having to melt down for the Spaniards the objects, and this same artist, already in a colonial context, you see that they are working near an arch, so it's a colonial building. So this same artist transforming and metamorphosing themselves during the colonial era to still produce new kind of objects and controlling fire in a new way. So along with the Florentine Codex, there are numerous other sources during in the context of the Iberian expansion, which precisely address the control over fire as a key, as a demonstration of the subtlety and the intelligence and artistic intelligence of the people encountered. The Florentine Codex did it for Mexico. The Codex Boxer did it for the Philippines. And this is a beautiful quotation that I would like just to read with you. It's also 16th century codex. It's housed at the Lily Library, and he talks about the body paintings of the Visayas in the Philippines. The Visayas are accustomed to painting their bodies with very delicate paintings. They make them with heated calamine brass, con hierros de azófar puestos en el fuego, so it's really the control over fire, and they have skillful masters who know how to make them well. They perform this work with such precision and with such perfection that they evoke admiration in whoever sees them. They resemble illumination. So the control over fire is in fact acknowledged precisely as a key, as a proof of the intelligence of the societies which are encountered in Mexico, in the Philippines, or in China. We know that porcelain was not only largely exported, which was largely desired precisely because the recipe to know how you produce these beautiful objects was in fact exactly one of the secrets was the very high temperature which was associated to this glaze, which I think is like 2000 Fahrenheit or something very, very, very high. So there are sources, Portuguese and Spanish sources in the 16th century which repeatedly mention this desire not only to obtain the object, but to obtain the recipe to arrive to this kind of material effect. So from China, I would like just to do a coda, which also is kind of open, perhaps the more artistic part of our gathering today, the exhibition, but also the performance of our artists today. And just to show an artist who has, for me, most creatively solved the dilemma of fire between the destructive and the constructive fire of fire, which is Kai Guochang, who is this Chinese artist who has this series of drawings called gunpowder drawings. He was displayed at the Guggenheim Museum 10 years ago, and he's touring everywhere, so perhaps you have seen his exhibition. It's very interesting how, in fact, the control over gunpowder and over fire is for him translating into explorations of art history in general. And I would like to show you just two images. Here is how it works, so how he controlled these gunpowder explosions to in fact create, this is my point, to create an exploration of art history. He creates, for instance, landscapes, which is one of the genres. In fact, I here, just to play a little bit, I put a Leonardo image and a Florentine Codex image just to show how landscape has been explored as a Western and Chinese, in fact, genre by different artists in different contexts. But so, and this is a gunpowder drawing, right? So through this control over fire and over gunpowder precisely, he's capable of exploring very, very deep moments and the inventions of the arts. And as a final image, he's even capable of exploring the very origins of the art, cave paintings, as we can see here. So it's just perhaps here through Kai Guochang, and again, this is why I felt it was very inspiring for me to put my own research and materials under pressure of this general team. Through Kai Guochang and through this dilemma of the constructive and the deconstructive, the destroying and constructive powers of fire, we can see, in fact, how there is the possibility of conciliating this dilemma and, in fact, stating that fire can be very creative as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very, very much for these very stimulating and incisive presentations. I think what we can do is, since we don't have a lot of time, is to invite our four panelists to just take a seat right here. And I thought what we might do, and we have microphones, so hopefully they can be heard, is to ask people to raise some general questions for conversation, to try also to not ask too specific a question. So this can be a general conversation, and then we'll have our panelists reflect and discuss some of the issues that were raised, hopefully between the presentations as well. So I'll collect questions, comments. You don't need to, but it would be good if you did.
Because I can see the chairs.
Yes. You need, yeah. Just otherwise, it'll be difficult to hear. Yeah, and I can ask.
This should be 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, maybe turn the lights.
You need one more chair, right? You need one more chair.
No, I'm fine. I'll just stand. I'll stand.
So 5, this is 4.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Seems that a common theme, at least from the 3 full talks that I heard, was fire's creative and destructive capacity. Are there any other ways to think of analytically other than just creation and destruction? Is there a third or a fourth way, or would that be the primary ways to think in terms of fire?
Great question. Other comments along those lines, or in different lines? Who's making noise? Jake.
In the interest of asking a very general kind of question, Steve Pine's talk last night, people wrestling with the way we deal with fire in the modern era, and the way that these several talks engaged historical fire. Do you have the sensation that the human relationship with fire is trending in a positive or negative direction, at least in the areas that you study?
por ejemplo, Sagún y Durán ven que en la época colonial se preservaban vestigios o restos de esas ceremonias. ¿Del Pueblo Nuevo hay algún registro que dé que al menos los indígenas de alguna zona conservaban esta tradición o festividad? Y por último a la doctora Russo. Tal vez no es el punto, mi inglés es muy bueno. El Códice Florentino, todas las imágenes que conserva, ¿usted cree que son inspiradas en grabados medievales o son de influencia indígena en la elaboración?
The first question relates to whether there are registers of different kinds of fire objects, and the second is whether or not the Florentine Codex reflects on medieval or was inspired by certain medieval models. And I think just to, and then we'll let you guys answer. To Jake's point, I think it's really interesting to think about, are there limits to thinking about fire from a historical perspective that in other presentations over the course of the last couple of weeks we've been able to see? And Alessandra certainly leapt over the historical barrier by engaging with a contemporary artist and asking these questions. But I think it's something as historians, or historical anthropologists, archaeologists, it's important to ask. So perhaps just a few reflections on these questions. Alessandra.
Just to answer to the two first question, and then I can also. Yeah. Is it? Yeah. Is it? So I think that both are very pertinent to and critical in a dialogic way to what we did. I think that you mentioned this term of spectrum, no? And I think that it's not just destructive and constructive, there is an entire spectrum of possibilities. But for me, to go back to the second question, in the 16th century, there is a particular dilemma between destructive and constructive because it's a context of conquest. So there, perhaps, the spectrum of possibilities is perhaps synthesized in a more strong way into this kind of antagonic outcomes, the destruction and the construction. But there are many other possibilities. I mean, even the image of Cortés being transformed into the conquistador by the power of the feather object. So it's in fact, its destructive power comes from a constructive power of the object. So I think that the term of spectrum is very interesting, but perhaps to go back to your question, there are historical moments where the destructive and the constructive are more in tension. I think the Americas in the 16th century is exactly one of those. And perhaps it's a very specific question, but just to answer you very briefly, I think the Codex Florentine is both a Western and indigenous and New Spanish artifact, so we cannot in fact reduce it to a medieval copy, a copy of medieval or an indigenous artifact. Is a very powerful creative masterpiece, and we need to address all the possibilities of it without reducing it to any one of it.
Mm-hmm. Maybe yeah. About new fire ceremony. In the colonial period, I think the text from Juan Teton I mentioned is one of the few examples of the possible realization of this ceremony in colonial times. Maybe it was celebrated in other parts, but I don't have notice of it. What is interesting is there is an ethnographic record, for example, between Tlapanecs of Guerrero. They have a new fire ceremony who has been studied by Daniel de Houve, and there is coincidences with ancient rituals, but they did it once a year, especially for new authority in investiture. And about the relationship between fire and water, there is a lot of symbolism with the association between fire and water in ancient Mexico. There is a Nahuatl difracismo, Atlacinoli, which means water and fire or field fire. And this was the glyph of war. And in ancient Mexico, war is a way to generate life as well, like sacrifice. So there is this combination between water and fire who have a very generative power. Well, just like what you said about the field, burning the field and then the water, and both of them are necessary for life. And war in ancient Mexico was a means to make captive and sacrifice them, and so the life going on. So that's the point.
I think what we're hearing here is that I guess maybe it's a Western perspective to think of it in binary opposition of constructive or destructive, but especially for indigenous peoples that it's more of a dialectical relationship, right? That it can actually be both at the same time, right? And so if I think about the landscapes of northern New Mexico, while we think about these recent wildfires being destructive, in fact, it constructs a whole new landscape. So there's a different regime of plants that takes over after the ponderosa pine forests take over. People tend to want things to stay the same, so they see it as destructive, but in fact, if you look at it, there's an entirely new something that's going to come out of that. But I think that's, in terms of the long-term perspectives, I don't know if I have an answer to the human trajectory, but I think there's different, kind of fundamentally different ways to look at how the world operates, and that's, in the West we often have these kind of dividing oppositions, but I think in a lot of indigenous cultures they think of more in terms of those two oppositions can exist simultaneously in the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to reiterate on that, I mean, that's one of the things I was playing with some of the fire symbolism, is there's very much this idea that sometimes in some contexts there's the specificity that the Maya needed to talk about fire, but for the most part it's very ambiguous, that you see fire starts to look like plants, which starts to look like smell, which starts to look like aromas, and this very much also feeds into what's probably a sort of a sense of fire as something that's both sort of insubstantial and uncontrollable and amorphous. It's this weird entity that both is, very physically omnipresent, but at the same time sort of uncontrollable and ethereal. And it's sort of, these themes get very much played with that I think are important for thinking about fire.
Parker. Thank you. Sort of following the line of Matt and Andrew's comments there at the very end, having gone to Steve Pine's talk yesterday, I found one of the things that was most frustrating about it, that fire was such a totalizing concept, that there was no way to get out of the fire effectively. And also that fire was a thing. And what you seem to be suggesting is that in some contexts, fire is almost epiphenomenal, like epiphenomenal with smoke, or that fire is a manifestation of some other kind of more essential thing. So, I mean, I wonder if you might be able to say a little bit more about that, Andrew, along the lines of what you were already saying about how, is fire actually just one iteration of something larger? And similarly, Matt, in the context in which you're working, and also Alessandra and Guilhem, what is fire's thingness? And what's its status as an object or as a process? And what is its relationship to other sorts of things? And
Gotcha. Anybody else wants to add on that topic? The answer, please.
Read Leonardo da Vinci's writings on fire to think about thingness. I mean, the variety of possibilities now of writing about fire. It's fascinating, the intensity, the difference between flame and fire, etc. He has pages and pages and pages and pages on that. So, I mean, I think to answer, you need to be an artist, or you need to be, you need to have a knowledge of the material to answer to your question of the thingness or the materiality of fire, not only as a concept now, but it's the way it behaves, the way it moves, the way it is. No? I think you need to have a very, very close knowledge of it. You need to play with fire.
Or we just need to have that manuscript here at this library.
Possibly.
You guys want to comment on?
I can't really speak to the ontological status of fire for the Pueblos, only because I'm not, right? I mean, there are obviously words for fire, but when you're asking the question, Parker, I flash back to second grade where we were learning liquids, solids, gases, and I distinctly remember asking my teacher, well, what's fire, right? Because it doesn't seem to really fit. If it's a gas, it stays in one place, it doesn't distribute. And I think the answer came back that there's a fourth category that's like plasmas, right? And it maybe fits it. But anyway, it just speaks to the point where it is this thing that actually is so, it doesn't fit neatly into our standard categories. I wish I could conceptualize of how Pueblo people think of that differently, but I don't really have a great answer for you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some sense it's contextual, but like, especially if you're talking about sort of indigenous understandings of many things, is it takes on many meanings simultaneously all at once. And I think especially thinking about something like, you know, the Aztec 52-year new fire ceremony. I mean, this is a singular spectacle that somebody would only ever witness once in their life. And so it's this creation, that sort of this creation of divine fire that very much is connected with very much tropes of creation and day, night, and, you know, the beginnings of the world and things like that. So in that sense, it's that fire is sort of takes on this sort of an uber dimension, as opposed to like just starting the fire in the hearth, but at the same time there is a continuity of understanding, right, that these things are sort of two sides of very much the same coin, that they're not necessarily divorced. So in some sense it's sort of what I was saying, is that things can be both, you know, unique and in particular and sort of common and mundane, but actually operating all at the same sort of time. So it's like everything and nothing all at once kind of thing. So a dissatisfying answer to your question, I guess.
Well, I think just to kind of expand on this too, so some of the things that we've been exploring over these past 2 weeks is that interplay between the elements as we conceive of the earth itself, and fire really standing out as being something quite different from that. It's been a process or a reaction or a, you know, it's not so much an element in space as a process in time, and so it's fire, I think, is coming across as something fundamentally different from the way that we've been thinking about earth, air.
Absolutely. It's also interesting, this is just a slow segue to the exhibition session, that when I saw the exhibition, I was struck by the extent to which fire is depicted both in the sources, but also it was selected as humans' interaction with fire, the way that that communities have used fire over time for different things. And that's probably both a bias of the sources and also a bias of trying to get us to relate to what is actually going on. It's not just flame that just appears. It's flame being harnessed for particular reasons at particular times to particular ends, which we see, I think, very clearly in a lot of the examples that all of you gave as well. Yes, please. Oh.
Where I haven't heard August, which maybe you've already dismissed that as being a relevant category, but it is a noun. There's caloric, there are other ways of talking about these things which make them more like an entity rather than a process. But I had a slightly different question actually. I was wondering if in the historical record in Mexico, in Mayan culture, if there's a pre-colonial in some sense, if there was ever any equation of fire to the life force, like blood or something like that. Fire having the same sort of signifying.
Life force?
The life force.
Life force.
Yeah.
Like fire is a life force.
Yeah. Indeed, we have, for example, Nahuatl text that speak of the supreme deity, Tlokenawake, and it says that the supreme deity sent a little flame to the body of the women so they can have children. You know, like sparks, you know. Mm-hmm. So there is the idea of life force with fire, you know.
Yeah. It's more a kind of methodological point that I wanted to make, and which relates several of the questions and also yours. Now, what is the Codex of Florentine Law? Is medieval? Is indigenous? Now, so we keep referring not to these voices as indigenous, but in fact, these documents, also the ones that you use, that many of them are colonial.
Yeah.
So, which makes it even more difficult, which adds an element of difficulty of addressing the essence, the ontology, or the meanings, right? This is why do I keep going back to Leonardo da Vinci, because I think that the documents that Pamela Smith works on, in fact, are much more related to Mexico in the 16th century than what we think. So it's just to make it even more complex. It's not only that fire has an entire spectrum between destruction and creation, but also that the documents that we work on, visual or textual, are let's say the effect of all these spectrums of conquest, of mestizaje, of hybridity, that we want to use those terms or not. But in fact, these are not pure objects where we can track the indigenous or the European. So in fact, we need to know as much about European concepts of fire as pre-Hispanic concepts of fire when we work on the Florentine Codex. And this makes it more challenging and more intellectually challenging, but more difficult. So it was just a little ontological point.
Just one other final point on that question of sort of fire and animate life force. In some sense, at least with the Maya, it's not even so much particularly about fire, but especially balances of hot and cold. And you got a little bit of that in that quote that I read from Pedro Pitarch at the end of mine, is that life is all about finding that balance of hot and cold, and heat unruly is dangerous and harmful. At the same time, an absence of heat is effectively death. And so it's finding that sort of that balance between the temperatures is fundamentally what is life.
Any other questions or comments before we switch and segue to the penultimate or anti-penultimate, if you want to call drinks the penultimate phase? Okay, well, why don't we thank our panelists. What I'd like to do now is to invite Jake Frederick up to give a very short overview of some of the relevant themes, and then we'll all walk over and see a few of the items in the exhibition.
Well, thank you, everyone. I take that very short quite seriously. I understand that I am the thing that stands between you and a chance to get up and stretch your legs, so I will try to be relatively brief. First of all, I would very much like to thank Neil, the JCB, and several members of the staff here on behalf of Júnia, Furtado, and myself, who did a tremendous job putting together this exhibition. We had the freedom to just select things. They had to actually figure out how to make them look organized and well put together. So I would like to thank Tara Kingsley, Ken Ward, and Scott Elwood for their excellent work. So when we were asked to do this exhibition, I was very excited. My first vision was just image after image of enormous conflagrations, cities burning, and something akin to the Great London Fire. And that might be something that is one day said in front of my trial. I do have more of an affection for fire than perhaps I should. And there are images in the JCB's collections that depict that. You'll notice one here that's the burning of New York at the time of the American Revolution. But Júnia in particular brought some more ideas to the table. And one of the things that we discovered is in the vast collections of the JCB, and please correct me if I have these numbers wrong, I think there are 50,000 documents, 7,000 early American images, 500 political cartoons, there are 3,000 maps, there's images from the John Russell Bartlett collection. Fire appears as ubiquitous across all human experiences, as destructive, as constructive. I started to think about other things we might use. Júnia and I thought about the terrible images of fire that we see so many of, like the images of torture that appear in images from Bartolomé de las Casas' brief history of the destruction of the Indies. And it was quickly apparent to us that fire is in everything. And to talk about fire is really to talk about really the scope of the experience in the Americas. It's also the scope of the experience in the world, but we could at least narrow ourselves down to a couple of continents. And so what we decided we wanted to do was to try to capture the breadth of the geography that is captured here in the JCB. So we tried to use sources that gave images all the way from Canada to Tierra del Fuego, and to capture the chronology that the JCB demonstrates. So with luck, you will find things represented here from the 16th century all the way through to the 19th century. And I say that's with luck. That's not true. I know you will in fact find that. And what we find, we had to categorize the different appearances of fire so that we could at least attach them to different kinds of human experience. So one of the 6 sections you will find is fires in daily life, where we see fire being used to create the domestic. Fire is a singularly human element. There's nothing else that has control over it like we do. And we use it to envision our homes. And it's what makes homes homes. Soon after, we get to contact, confrontation, and condemnation. And this is where fire reveals much of its uglier side. We see the images that do come from the Conquest, and we see what I think is fire exerting its own will over humanity itself. This is where we see human beings feeding one another into fires in the names of their gods, in the names of their political desires. And this is something that is taking place on both the European side and the Native American side. And these are sometimes displayed as condemnations as well, because misuse of fire, fire itself is a sign of civilization. Misuse of fire can be used as a sign of barbarity, and it's definitely deployed in that way. We also include fueling colonization, the way that fire spreads across the landscape. Fire is, of course, everywhere before the Europeans arrive, but domesticated fires are used to represent the spread of colonization. Then there is consumption, commodities and consumption. Fire is what makes things like tobacco have a useful function. It's what allows us to turn cacao into that marvelous frothy drink. It also allows us to fuel the sugar mills that will turn Brazil into a commodity generating locale. The next section is fire as foe. There is a point in here where we didn't really, someone raised the good point that fire is always described here in relation to humanity. It is here described in the same way, but these are fires that are acting independently. There's an image from John Russell Bartlett's exploration of the Southwest, an image of a prairie fire running across the landscape. This is fire under its own control. We also have an image of a volcano, which was once again fire acting at its own disposal, very often to the destruction of the human endeavor. The last section wraps up the colonial era with fires of resistance. Fire turns into a metaphor in almost any environment that you use it, but fire is the term we use to describe people becoming anxious, exhilarated about a particular political movement, a religious movement. And in our final images in section 6 here, we see fire as it appears as a vehicle of resistance to the colonial world, the moment at which the torch of power is passed, or I think better said, wrenched away from the Europeans and taken to the Americas. And so to allow people to get up and walk around as soon as possible, rather than me continuing to pontificate up here, what I thought I would do is I would simply show you 4 of my favorite images from this collection of 50, and whoever would like to come along, I can tell you about my 4 favorites. You get to hear the secret in just a moment. And then you are free to mingle.
And all of that will happen while the bar is being set up. So this is a good thing.
And I want to thank Neil for pointing out that, not pointing out that the bar is going to be set up when Jake stops talking before this point.